This presentation will focus on Chapter 5 from Interplay and the topic of language. We will particularly be looking at precision and vagueness in language, and how the language that we use intentionally, sometimes unintentionally. We'll focus on 5 concepts in this area: ambiguous language, abstract language, the use of euphemism, relative language, and static evaluation. The first type of language we'll look at is ambiguous language. Ambiguous language simply refers to the fact that there are words and phrases in our language that may be interpreted in more than one way, or have more than one commonly accepted definition. As you're probably aware, the English language especially has a lot of words and phrases interpreted or defined in multiple ways. We see an example of this in the illustration on this slide. The text message conversation between a father and a child. The child says, "Mom wants you to get her Prego." And the dad responds, "Well, I can't. I had that problem solved years ago." The issue here is the ambiguousness of the word Prego. As you may be aware, Prego is a type of spaghetti sauce. It also is a slang term that's used for a woman being pregnant. So the first statement can be interpreted in 2 different ways, either as Mom wants you to get her some spaghetti sauce, or Mom wants you to get her pregnant. You can see how the misinterpretation of the word, the ambiguous language, can create confusion. We can also think about the fact that many words in our language have multiple definitions or multiple accepted meanings. Think about concepts like love and how many different ways we might describe or define love. If you say you love your mom or you love your dad, is that the same as saying that you love pizza? So the use of ambiguous language often leaves the interpretation open to the receiver, and we need to be aware of these situations where we may be using terms that have more than one meaning and provide clarity when necessary. Because language is ambiguous, this sometimes contributes to our second type of vague language, which is abstraction. Abstraction refers to our tendency to speak about or communicate about things in general terms, in ways that leave the statement open to interpretation. Whether these are statements about individuals or about events or about things. One way the concept of abstraction is illustrated is by the use of a ladder, as we see in the graphic on this slide. Metaphorically, if you think about it, if you've ever been on a ladder, you know the closer you are to the ground, the more secure or more stable you feel. As you move higher and higher on the ladder, the less secure and less stable you feel. This is depicted in the abstraction ladder by the bottom of the ladder representing ideas that are very specific and concrete. As we move up the ladder, we move into language and statements that are less specific, less clear, and more open to interpretation. For example, you can see in the graphic the statement, "You need to have a better attitude," is at the very top of the ladder. Well, that's a very broad statement. It doesn't tell us much about what's wrong with our attitude or what we might have to change, or what does a better attitude even mean. You can see as we go down the ladder, the statements are getting more and more specific in order to inform the individual how they can change their attitude or why the individual even thinks they have a bad attitude. And at the very bottom of the ladder, we see the statement, "You need to quit complaining every time we have to work late or come in on weekends." This is a very specific statement that illustrates why this person believes you may have a bad attitude. Abstraction doesn't just apply to negative or critical statements. Even in expressing appreciation, we can be more abstract and kind of leave some of the true meaning of the statement out. To say to someone, "You've been a great boss," well, that's always nice to hear. But what specifically has someone done that makes them a great boss? So we may identify specific behaviors like, "You've been willing to rearrange my work schedule when I've needed to." We may also use abstract language when expressing goals, like, "I'd like to be more assertive." Well, what specifically can you do to be more assertive? Or what do you need to change in order to be more assertive? So a statement like, instead of apologizing, I want to keep saying, "I'm not interested," until the salesperson goes away. That's one way to say you'd like to be more assertive. So these are a couple of additional examples of how abstract language can be made more precise. As we can imagine, the use of abstract language can lead to a variety of situations or misunderstandings as illustrated. Sometimes it's difficult to decipher the true meaning of a message when abstract or general terms are used rather than specific terms or identifying specific behaviors. Speaking of individuals and situations in terms of abstraction can also lead us into stereotyping and broad generalizations. When speaking in generalities, these abstract statements can also become self-fulfilling prophecies. As we've already mentioned, abstract statements can lead to serious misunderstandings, as also have been illustrated in the previous slide. The way we avoid abstractions is by using more behavioral descriptions. And we've had some practice with using behavioral descriptions, as we discussed perception checking in Chapter 3. As you may recall, the process of perception checking starts by describing the situation or the behavior of an individual. The next type of vague language is euphemism, and euphemism is where we change the language that we use to make something that isn't pleasant sound more pleasant, or maybe something that might be perceived as critical sound less harsh. One common example of euphemism is when we talk about death. Typically, if we've had a relative or friend who's died, when someone asks about that person, it seems kind of harsh to say, well, mom died or dad died. So we may use terms like mom has passed on or dad is no longer with us. Other examples of euphemism we may consider when we're talking about other people and maybe aspects of an individual's personality that the words we use may come across as critical. For example, maybe you have friends who have a child and the child misbehaves a lot. One word that you might use to refer to that child is a brat, or we might use another word and say the child is spoiled. Or we may choose not to use these words because it would likely come across as very harsh and negative. We might use the statement, your son or daughter seems to be very strong-willed. Another type of vague language is relative language. And this is the idea that words that we use can only gain meaning based on comparisons. One example of this, my mother and father-in-law used to live out in the country in Owen County. When we would go visit them, they'd want to go someplace, like somewhere to eat or somewhere to shop. And we'd usually ask, okay, well, how far is it? Their response was, oh, it's just around the corner. Well, we'd get into the car and start driving and drive and drive and drive, and about 20 minutes later we're still driving to get to where the restaurant is or the store. Being from the city, for me, something to be just around the corner means that it's literally just around the corner, maybe a few blocks away, or maybe 5 minutes to get there. So by comparison, our perceptions of how close just around the corner is differ based on our points of comparison. Another way to illustrate the concept of relative language is when we think about the size of a person. To illustrate this, I need to tell you I'm 5 feet 4 inches tall. So if I say someone is tall, how tall would that person have to be? Well, they probably would have to be taller than me for sure, but most likely for me, a person that is 6 feet or 6 feet 2 or taller, I would classify as tall. But imagine someone who's 6 feet 5 inches tall and they remark that someone is tall. Well, how tall does that person have to be? We can think about other terms like when we say someone is nice or someone is mean. Well, what are our points of comparison? And that's why relative language can be problematic. Our final example of vague language is a concept called static evaluation. Static evaluation is when we use language that expresses things in a way that assumes an individual or a thing is consistent and cannot change. Here's an example, and maybe this has happened to you. A friend of yours meets you after class and says, "My teacher is such a jerk." Based on the way that it's stated, "My teacher is a jerk," it implies that this individual is this way, a jerk, at all times and across all situations. This creates a problem because when someone overhears someone saying that a person is a jerk, then that leads to the perception that that person is always a jerk. To avoid static evaluation, we need to be more precise in making our statements or categorize those statements. For example, if your friend said, "I hate it when the teacher gives us a surprise test," that really makes me think that he or she is a jerk. The statement is less drastic and simply states in certain situations the teacher may be perceived as a jerk. So in review, in this presentation, we've looked at particular aspects of language with regard to precision and vagueness and discussed 5 different types of language that can be less precise than we may intend for it to be. We've looked at ambiguous language, the concept of abstract language, the use of euphemism, relative language, and static evaluation. Hopefully, by better understanding these types of vague language, we also have come to understand why these types of language may be problematic, as well as some strategies for avoiding these types of language in our interaction.